This is Amend and Progress, your go-to podcast from Vodori for all things promotional material review. Get ready for actionable insights, valuable perspectives, and best practices to elevate your workflow and team morale.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Benchmarks Symposium 2024, a special edition of Amend and Progress, where we're focusing the conversation on Vodori's 2024 State of Promotional Review Benchmarks Report. I'm your host, Annalise, and today I'm joined by a panel of women at Vodori to talk a little bit about best practices. We're going to be focusing the conversation today on the survey portion of the report and some best practices that we think are extremely applicable to some of the key takeaways and observations from that survey. So joining me in the conversation today is Lauren Walker, Director of Customer Success at Vodori. Hello, Lauren.
Hey, Annalise. Thanks for having me.
Lindsay Magera, Customer Success Manager at Vodori.
Great to be here.
And Elizabeth Calderon, Customer Success Manager at Vodori. Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
So I've all made you come on the podcast before, so hopefully folks have heard from you before, and I usually bring you all on to talk about best practices. That's really your wheelhouse at Vodori, what you help our customers do day in and day out. And so just to give the audience a little bit of a context to the conversation for today, we survey our customers as part of the annual benchmarks report at Vodori. We ask specific questions like their challenges in the given year, challenges they're anticipating the next year, how they're working with agencies, where they're running into specific review bottlenecks, just to get more of a qualitative feedback around the process and their challenges within the organization. And in the surveying of the 2024 report, really what came to light in terms of key observations or takeaways was content's hard to create. There's a lot of pressure to create a lot of great content. There's a lot of pressure to create different types of content at a high speed. Websites, video, there's a whole I think, host of things that organizations are trying to create to support their commercial functions, but they're still resource constrained. That is something we continue to hear from our customers. And so that's one of the primary challenges I think we'll talk a little bit about today. Agency coordination has come up as a bit of a challenge here, of course, tied to content creation. Of many of our customers are using agencies to create their content. And then I think there's a little bit around just like review specific challenges in terms of, okay, we've created this great content. I want to get it to market, but I'm just running into these specific challenges during review. And so a lot of what we're going to be talking about today just wraps around that whole topic around getting content to market and some of these common challenges we're running into. And so, Lauren, I'd love to start with you, hearing sort of that background, and I know you've been very closely involved in the surveying as well. What comes top of mind for you to sort of address that beast in totality? And are there any specific best practices that you think are going to be more applicable this year, just given these challenges that we know of from our customer base?
I certainly think there are. And I think overall, as we talked about in the last podcast that I was on with you, all of it comes down to working with other people. And I think a great place to start for our customers and others when you're working in any kind of process and utilizing a system is setting ground rules and an understanding for how you're going to work together. Because if you have that baseline for how you're going to be communicating feedback, how you're going to be communicating turnaround time and what's needed from each other, you have somewhere to start from and somewhere to improve upon. And I know both Lindsay and Elizabeth probably have great examples specific to their customer bases and segments, but that's where I would start is create ground rules and go from there.
And where should ground rules like this live?
That is a great question. Somewhere where people are able to access it. If that's a centralized drive that your team uses, if that's where your policies and procedures generally are stored, somewhere that's easy to find for anybody who needs to be in the system or as a part of the process.
Okay, that makes total sense. And I think one thing you and I have talked about in the past are SOPs and having some of these ground rules within those SOPs. I know that sometimes it's helpful to have reviewer purview guidance of hey, certain department, when content gets to review, this is really what we want you to be focused on. And I imagine this might help with just some of the review specific challenges of you're getting comments from maybe legal on brand and it can create just a lot of like back and forth. Are there any types of like specific ground rules you've seen be really successful in just like facilitating a great review process?
I think what's important is, especially when it comes to reviewers, like you talked about, if it's legal, if it's medical, if it's regulatory, outlining the very specific facets of the content that they should be focusing on and that you want to make sure they're looking at. Whether it's the references and resources you're referring to within your content, whether it's the language you're using surrounding product mentions, whether you're allowed to refer to your product in that way or generally, those are like the specific bullets that you want beneath each review group that you have as a part of your process to say, hey, focus on these things for me. That's what I'm going to be looking for from you. And also is very much a part of their roles and responsibilities generally.
Lindsay and Elizabeth, just curious to hear from you both. Like, are you seeing this work as well with your customers and sort of these ground rules and any like additional rules you would bring to the table as being particularly helpful here?
I think the ground rules is very important in setting that stage of those expectations. Um, Collaboration is a great thing, but sometimes you can get caught up in the moment, and it's easy to move across those swim lanes. I think there are a lot of features in the system that also can kind of help guardrail and set some boundaries as well. So as Lauren said, I do think it's important to set that stage and those ground rules outside of the system. And then there are ways to kind of pull that into the system too.
Mm-hmm. Use systems to your advantage to help
Yeah,
facilitate those ground rules. Yep.
exactly. There's certainly a
Mm-hmm.
human aspect to this, but there are certain system values that can be put into place as well.
Elizabeth, what about you?
Yeah, I was gonna say something similarly. When you put the work up front, you can see the benefits right away from your marketing team, the initiators, the reviewers very quickly. So I think just making sure that you spend some time in the beginning. Some of those process guidelines I've been focused on with my customers, obviously, we're always going to refine. So it's never going to stay the same, especially with new team members that come on board. We release new features quite frequently, so we want to keep updating that. But just being specific around the process that you create, like for example, figuring out how much content you're going to have for maybe the next 6 months or the next year, if you can think that far ahead. Thinking about what's the expected turnaround time so that everyone is aligned. There's no expectations to get it done tomorrow. There's clear outline on that. And then also figuring out and determining which reviewers are required to review which pieces. It may be different for the type of content that you're submitting. And then also, if there's minor changes, creating an expedited review or just a minor revision process. So those minor changes might not require your entire MLR team. So some of those items to start thinking about to create in your process guidelines and your SOPs.
I'm particularly interested in the different review types or workflows. So this has actually come up on the podcast in other areas of conversation of not everyone needs to be involved every time. Is that a hard message to sell internally, or what do we advise our customers around in terms of like making the case for, okay, for this content subtype, it really only needs XYZ department because of certain factors? Like, have we been hard pressed to sell these types of maybe like expedited reviews, and how can organizations either identify those opportunities or make the case for implementing those at their organization?
I'm happy to jump in first just with some background knowledge on when it first comes to implementation talks about this with our customers. I think a lot of it depends on how mature their process is and their comfort with some of these things. If they're fresh, they're brand new, they haven't experienced a process like this before, or it's just being built, oftentimes they tend to lean a little bit more towards adding everybody in that process until they get comfortable with where are the boundaries and lines with what content I'm comfortable in not including somebody in, or where they're really needed. I think with some of our customers who have a more mature process or are coming to us having used a prior system or a different process that was in place, they know the learnings from what took a little bit longer, what they're comfortable with, and it continues to evolve. Just like Elizabeth and Lindsay said, as that process continues to get more mature and the comfort is there and the content types might be changing that they're creating, they get more and more comfortable or more and more confident in who actually needs to be looking at something, the turnaround times for those things. And ultimately, if there's features at their fingertips in the system that they're using that enable that process to go even more smoothly and get more comfortable, it's even better.
I think that's just like, it's come up before. I think it's just something that folks are talking about. If I have a tweet about, this is Anne Swearingen's classic lineups, come see us at booth 75. Do we need every reviewer involved in a tweet that says something like that? And so I was just curious to get your perspectives there. Lindsay, I'll pitch it to you, thinking about the totality of the customer survey, some of those key takeaways and observations. Curious to hear from you on like what best practices or things resonated with you or, are top of mind as we think about sort of the readout of the survey.
Great starting point. I think there's a lot that we got out of that survey, and there's a lot of best practices out there. I think some things that stuck with me in particular is using the data to inform you in your training opportunities. Maybe it's in workload balance, and looking at those metrics and being kind of creative and strategic on how you're using the benchmarks and how those play at your organization. Um, Another thing that I think I like to see and like to emphasize, and I'm seeing more and more of it with my enterprise customers and our large enterprise organizations, is the thought of surveying your own people. So we like to collect surveys at Vodori. We like to scrutinize the data. We like to look at it. But I think just in general, collecting user feedback is a best practice. And so what I'm finding from customers that, have hundreds of users, varying degrees of learning and understanding, also collecting that quantitative piece directly from their users brings a lot back to the table. They can hear firsthand from their people, and maybe then they can address things, whether it is through more training or more, tailored training, if it's business process communication and education, or SOP changes and bettering those work instructions. I think there's a lot that can be gathered out of surveying your own people. So as much as I love our Vodori surveys and looking at the data and then using that to benchmark, I do think there's something to be said for also implementing survey strategies at your own organization too.
I want to pause here because I think you beautifully introduced this point, and I didn't even have to like force it on any of you, and like ask your users how it's going.
Yes.
And in this report, we talk a little bit about this in terms of an organization could be led astray if they take a look at the benchmarks and say, "Oh, we're at benchmark, we're better than benchmark." But if their users are still unhappy about something, they feel like the process isn't going the right way, there are certain bottlenecks they're running into, on a regular basis, those two things are a little bit in conflict with one another. The benchmark alone could tell the organization, you're doing really good, keep going. But without knowing and understanding how your users are feeling about the process, I think is a huge piece of this puzzle in terms of just like identifying optimization opportunities. So a beautiful insert to just ask your users how it's going. Any particular questions that you think would be advantageous to ask beyond like how you think it's going, or like just curious, you don't need to have like formal things, right? But maybe even just like topic areas you've seen be helpful in uncovering maybe some of the sticking points?
I think some thoughts that are coming to my mind are just, where are the painful areas? Asking for, where do you need more training? Where do you need more internal resources? It may feel like we have so many resources out there in different mediums, but something could be missing, or people just don't know where to find said resource at their fingertips. I think asking about what's going well. It's also nice to celebrate the wins, especially for our system owners out there who do a really great job and a not glamorous job of keeping the system up to date and relaying business processes to make sure system matches and managing all of this on top of their already busy plate. So I think it's a good chance to get some kudos back and share that, keep that positive culture going, like Lauren said. We all have to do this process, but reminding people about the good things that we have. And then I think, make sure you collect what department they're with, what is their role in the system that they are playing. Are they in a different region? Things of like that, just so you have a better context of who is responding in your surveys and kind of how you can then tailor those results into next steps. Some initial thoughts.
No, that's beautiful. I think that's super helpful. Elizabeth, curious to hear from you. Like, any reactions to any of what's been said already, or like anything else you think is important to bring to the table here in terms of best practices applicable to the observations from this year's survey?
Yeah, I have a couple of things. I'll say one, but before I jump into that, Lindsay mentioned the survey. I would also highly recommend having it an anonymous survey just so that they feel more free to share honest feedback, whether it's good or bad. I feel that that's really beneficial for everyone. Just keep it anonymous.
Perfect.
And then the other recommendation I would have, which Lindsay, I'm sure you've covered this with your customers as well, is the quality of content that's being routed for review. It's been a big topic over, I know this year, the last couple of years that we've been focusing on, which relates to the data that we monitor. So when the marketing team, the content owners, initiators are looking at, all of the content that reviewers are leaving behind. One, maybe they're taking a longer time to review. They're leaving a lot of feedback. Why is that? Again, it goes back to the beginning. Let's make sure that we address some of these changes that the reviewers are constantly requesting before we put it through for approval. Some of my customers also loop in the key parties soon during the content development process so that by the time it reaches that final approval, there's less questions, there's less feedback. And if there is feedback, another thing that we like to monitor are the themes that are requested among our reviewers. Typically, what we see is that the comments that they're leaving behind are the same. So making sure that we capture those themes, we share it back to whoever's initiating that piece and make sure that we just capture those items before we send it out to the review team. Another note that I'll say about the annotations, which I know I've covered in the past a couple of times, is just making sure that you have a process for your annotations. The initiators or whoever's helping prepare that piece, sometimes they might get overwhelmed when they're looking at all of the annotations. How do you quickly glance at which ones you have to, are required, you need to update, and which ones are maybe up for discussion? So just making sure that you have a process around maybe required versus suggested annotations and feedback.
I could see that being helpful really too with the agency coordination piece. We know that a lot of our customers have to consolidate the feedback to then share with the agency for content revisions. If there's complete clarity over the feedback and the annotations, it just takes hopefully a little bit less time and there's just that much more actionable feedback that person can work on with the agency. So I see it being incredibly relevant there. Before we actually hit record, Elizabeth, you had brought up a checklist concept. I'm wondering if you could speak to a little bit in terms of, I know like one of the, observations from the survey is just like, we have to create all of this crazy creative content all the time. And it's a challenge. And so you had sort of quipped around some of checklist idea. Could you just speak to that quickly and just describe that a little bit?
Yeah, especially for our customers that are new to web content review. Vodori, we created a checklist where in buckets, we have everything that a reviewer should look out for whenever they're renewing. Because again, it's a new process for everyone. So we want to make sure that we're as efficient as we can. So and it's maybe a 2-pager very quickly, reviewers just check it off as you're reviewing, specifically your web content review, and you can even replicate it for just other content that you have also, copy paste or rearrange as needed.
I think
Just
that
adjusting those
process.
things like, oh yeah, go ahead, Lindsay. Sorry.
I was
No,
just
go
going to say,
ahead.
I think that checklist idea makes a lot of sense too. One of the content types that's increasing in popularity, to no one's surprise, is social content. And that repeatable nature, to be able to quickly go through and review something like that, particularly when social content can be reactive in the moment, content is going to be supremely helpful too.
How do you make it as easy as possible, right? Especially with all these different content subtypes you're dealing with. You got to pay attention to links on the one thing and hashtags on the other. There's just so much to consider. And it harkens back a little bit to, I think, what we talked about earlier in the conversation of like, sometimes the upfront work is really worth it. So like, is it worth it to develop some of these checklists upfront that then would have like compounding, benefit down the road? So I think that's incredibly helpful. What else didn't we talk about, ladies? What else is top of mind for you? Any parting words or last things you want to share?
Mentioned social media, and that got me thinking about some conversations that we're also having with customers as they're creating more and more social media content over the last year. Creating also a process around your social media content, looping in people in the beginning, maybe having an expedited review for those social media posts that you need to publish in 2 days. So thinking around some of those process specifically also for social.
I think the thing I was thinking about that's a little bit related to the types of content that are being routed frequently, and you can categorize in different buckets and have different processes for. And this checklist idea is kind of combining those two together and utilizing your system to really enforce those checklist rules. Like, does this piece of content actually qualify for this type of review I'm trying to put it through? And can I answer these 6 questions to make sure it's working? Is like both process and system can work together to really help you enforce those policies and that upfront work that you're doing too.
I know it's not always feasible, but a lot of my larger customers actually have some kind of coordinator role that is kind of that human checklist, that pre-step, so that they can focus on, branding, is every claim substantiated, things like that up front before it gets to that full MRL process, which also kind of helps with your swim lanes because by the time it gets to that step, then it's very clear in your role what you're reviewing and approving. And then other system things that I was coming to mind when Elizabeth was chatting too was related to capturing vote reasons so that we can track some of those trends in the system and just like quick, concise feedback loop closures. And then also using an approved claims library. So there's less hunting around to find that substantiation as a reviewer. I'm more confident in that this claim is backed up appropriately, and your content owners are more confident and I can use this claim. I know this is approved language. So those are some things that I was percolating in my mind while you guys were speaking as well.
So helpful. And I think we've talked a lot. I think I've either talked with each of you individually or definitely today as a group about like this the pre-review concept or the like early that gate potentially that could be helpful in, is it the right logo? Are there any typos? Just the little things that can detract from the reviewer's purview once they get, into the review process. It's like, how can we just make sure that when the content gets to review, it's of the highest quality that we can possibly achieve at this point in time. It just helps, I think, everyone just spend hopefully less time looking at stuff like that and then really focusing in on their swim lane, to your point, Lindsay. Good deal. Well, ladies, thank you so much. This is so fun to have you all together, first of all, because it's just nice to see you all. But just really appreciate your time perspectives here today. Just excited to share these with our audience and get some good best practices out there.
Really, thanks for having us.
Yeah, this was fun.
Oh, good. I'm glad you think it's fun. I always think it's fun, but always a delight to be with you. And folks, go download Vodori's benchmarks report. You can download it at vodori.com/2024 benchmarks. You'll get the latest benchmarks for the promotional review process in addition to this customer survey readout, which I think will be hugely beneficial. Don't forget to subscribe to Amend and Progress, which you can find on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, this is Annalise. Have a fantastic day.